CEU Medieval Radio, Past Perfect, the talk show about medieval and early modern culture. Hello, dear listeners. This is Past Perfect, CEU Medieval Radio's podcast on medieval and early modern culture. My name is Anna Kinde, and I am here today with Václav Žůrek, a researcher at the Center for Medieval Studies and a postdoctoral fellow on Faculty of Arts at the Charles University in Prague. Václav is an expert in the 14th century courtly culture under the reign of the Luxembourgs. Currently, he shifted his focus on the medieval literary sources and manuscript production. It's nice to have you here, Václav.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm happy to be here with you.
Can you tell us in a few words about your current research project, Transmissions of Knowledge, the Fortune of Four Bestsellers in the Late Medieval Czech Lands? What does bestsellers mean in this context?
Of course, the word bestseller is a modern one, but we use it as a metaphor for wider received and read works in Middle Ages. And with our team, we are working on 4 concrete bestsellers, and they fade in the late Middle Ages in Central Europe, generally speaking. But especially we are focusing on medieval Czech lands, so the lands under the Luxembourg reign in 14th and 15th century.
How do you feel as a historian on working with literary works? Is it an easy task for you?
No, it's not an easy task. It's a challenging task, actually, because as a historian, I'm formed to work with diplomas and chronicles and text, what historians do. The literary sources are a little bit different, especially when you are dealing with some works with many manuscripts. You have the advantage that you can touch them and you can work with these material sources from the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. So you can not only read some nice edition of a Latin work, but you can really read these copies with many mistakes and marginal notes. So you can maybe see the people behind these manuscripts. And that's what we are interested in, actually. We are interested in readers, owners, scribes. Who were these people who transmitted the knowledge in medieval Czech lands? That's our main question. Are there any special channels of transmission? And that's our question too. Mm-hmm. And also what we want to contribute to is generally speaking, the cultural history of given region of, let's say, Czech lands under Luxembourg from half of 14th century until the end of 15th century, when early print changed a lot the situation in the transmission of knowledge.
Of course, yeah. What did you find in the manuscripts? What were like the signs that told you things about the makers and the scribes? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, what is not so surprising, but it's always nice to see it. It's there are many readers or tools and comments on works, like the scribe who finished the copy of a Latin work. He wrote there some vernacular comments, just like I'm happy to be at the end, and now I'm going to drink a beer because it's over. It's always nice to see it. Actually, the human face of the medieval scribe production. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that we can find some comments on the text. So the reader has found something interesting and he put a note on the margin. Look at this passage. It's really interesting, or it's surprising, or I know where it is from, even if it's not quoted.
So it's bragging about their knowledge. And what do you think the role of these manuscripts was in this late medieval Czech society?
Yeah, that's also our focus. They are very heterogeneous. Because we are dealing with bestsellers, we call them like this. We have these tens of manuscripts, let's say. Without this number, it's not possible to do this type of research. And if you have this, I'm working with 30 manuscripts, it's very heterogeneous. You have nice, expensive manuscripts, which were made surely for someone rich or important, like some high member of the chapter of the Prague Cathedral, so on, or some archbishop. And you have manuscripts that are cheap without any
embellishments.
Yeah, and embellishment, any luminous. They use only the one ink.
Yeah.
And nothing nice is there, but it could be cheap.
Yeah,
and it could be useful too. And it's heterogeneous also from the point of view of the codicology, because a codicological context is also interesting when you are dealing with some concrete text. What text were in the same manuscript copied with this text?
So one manuscript would contain multiple books, actually?
Yeah,
Could you say that?
Yeah. That's the case. Actually, sometimes you should be careful because these texts were put together in 16th or 17th century. But you can see it if you are looking at. And so that's also the point that you should go to libraries and work with these manuscripts in hand. Sometimes they are compilations of texts which were made already in Middle Ages, and you can see them from the codicological point of view. And sometimes you are lucky to have a medieval catalog where it's written what is there, and you have also the manuscripts nowadays, so you can see that it was together. And then when it was gathered in Middle Ages, it should be for some reason, for some reader or owner who wanted these texts together. And sometimes they are even texts copied by one scribe, different text, one scribe, one scribal hand. And then again come up the question why these texts were together.
Okay, now that we've talked about the circumstances, can you tell us about the texts themselves? Why do you think they became medieval bestsellers?
I start with the general choice of our project. We have 4 works in our focus. The first one is Secretum Secretorum, a pseudo-Aristotelian work translated from Arabic to Latin twice and widespread in all Europe. You can find it in every bigger library in Middle Ages. We have now more than 500 copies actually surviving.
That's a lot,
that's a lot. And Secretum Secretorum, the secret of secrets. The main point is that knowledge is a secret, or there is the basic idea is that there is a secret knowledge which could be known only for the important people, like rulers. It was copied a lot in the context of Mirrors for Princes, even though the text itself is not only about ruling, it's also about medicine, how to stay healthy. It's a lot about alchemy. And that's the first text. The second is Elucidarium, and text quite known for its explanation of Christian belief in a easy way. It's a dialogue.
Christianity for beginners.
Yeah, Christianity for beginners. It's a dialogue between a master and a pupil, and the pupil asks the basic question like, who is the God, how we know it, and so on, and how these things are happen around us, and the master will explain it in a really easy way. It was then translated even in many vernaculars actually, and was one of the point of our project. The choice of our text was that it should be also translated into medieval Czech to prove the popularity of the text. That's the second one. The third one is the Chronicle of Martinus Polonus, widespread chronicle about emperors and popes. Chronicle is quoted in late Middle Ages literally everywhere. Sometimes you can see it, sometimes it's quoted like Polonus said, etc. And sometimes you don't know it. But it was one of main source for historical knowledge in the late Middle Ages. And the fourth one is mine, and this is the treatise about game of chess from Jacobus de Cesolis, a Dominican monk from end of 13th and beginning of 14th century. This is very interesting text for me. It's a treatise about game of chess, but it's not really about chess, about playing chess. If you don't know how to play chess, you can't learn it from this text. Cesolis come up with an idea that the pieces of chess represent the society as it functions. So there is a king and queen. This allegory is quite obvious. Then there is bishop, but who represents for Cesolis not a clerk, but judges. Then you have knight, and it should be the knight, the power. And the rook should represent the king where he couldn't be. Just like in the game of chess. But the most original part is the explanation of common pieces. They are not the same. There are 8 commoners, 8 pieces, and each of them should represent one group of profession. Cesolis lived in a northern Italian town, so his idea was influenced by the reality of northern Italian towns at the end of 13th century. So you have there the farmer, the important part of the medieval society, of course, but then you have blacksmith, town officer, doctor, apothecary, scribe, etc. But what is for the reader interesting in the book from Cesolis is that he explained all these pieces with short stories from ancient world.
Wow.
He used a lot of exemplar from ancient Rome and Greece and partly from the Bible to explain what each piece of chess, what kind of moral they should follow.
Do these ancient stories come from actual ancient sources, or were they invented in the medieval times and had ancient characters, so to say?
They were not invented. The author doesn't work really with authentic works, literary sources from ancient Rome and Greece. He used the 12th century works like the Polycraticus of Salisbury, but the stories are authentic, founded in the literature. And they are also commonplaces of general knowledge of ancient world.
I see. And what did the readers look for in these works? Why did they read them?
This was my question at the beginning, and I'm trying to answer it now after 3 years of working with these manuscripts. After the reader's tools like register, marginal notes, we can see that readers in late medieval Bohemia were looking for these short stories. So they are very often written names in margins, so you can find really quickly stories about Alexander, or they are the morals, the virtues are written in margin, and you can find some short story about chastity. And the register is also made in this way, so you can see that this was interesting for medieval reader in Bohemia. Not the game of chess, but these short stories, the exemplar and the moralities about virtues.
Were these works always around in Bohemia, or did they appear at a certain period?
No, these works appeared in the second half of 14th century with the foundation of the university and with the growing number of people who could read, who have the time to read, and were interested in ancient world, in something what we can call classical knowledge. But what we can see also is that they were people looking for how to learn easy about ancient world. and they were looking for short stories, maybe for entertaining, maybe for learn it easily, because they wanted to quote it somewhere, but they don't want to go and read Cicero, but they want to show off that they are able to speak about the Roman emperors, for example.
And were these manuscripts mainly in Latin? So could they read Latin, or were the majority of them translated to the Old Czech?
The general situation of Cesolis is that it was in Latin, it was written in Latin and widespread in Latin, but there are more than 8 translations in vernacular in Europe, even in Sweden and Scotland, of course in France and Germany. And there is a Czech translation, which is rather the adaptation than a translation, because it was translated, but the translator, a prolific translator from 14th century, Tomáš of Štítné, left out almost 80% of short stories from ancient times. So apparently he was not interested in this part of the text, but he was interested in the part which we can call the mirror for princes, who should show how the king and noble people should behave to stabilize the society at the end of 14th century.
I have one more question about these books. So you said that these were meant for people who were sort of newcomers to the world of literature, so to say. How would you compare the physical books to modern books? Were they harder to read than modern books, or easier to read? Was there anything in the book that would help the readers understand the text better?
Yes, of course, there are features of the text. They can help the reader, like the headings in other ink, especially red one, so you can find quickly where the other chapter begins. Sometimes they are underlined interesting parts of the text, like authorities. When the Valerius Maximus is quoted and Valerius is underlined, so you can quickly find the quotation. But it's the same with the marginal notes. It's just a different feature to help the reader with the quick orientation in the text. And that could show us that the text was not meant to be read from the beginning to the end, but to the everyday use of some preacher or student who need to find really quickly some information about concrete person or about this virtue.
Sort of as a reference book.
Yeah.
A medieval Wikipedia, if you will.
maybe a handbook for students, teacher, preacher.
Do you personally have a favorite manuscript out of the 30-something that you've been working with?
Yeah, well, everybody likes the illuminated manuscripts because they are nice and they show us more from the medieval reality. The specialty of this work of Jacobus de Cesolis is that each figure, each chapter about chess pieces starts with a description of the figure. What you have in left hand and right hand and so on. So illuminators in Middle Ages could easily, after this description, made illumination. So there is a standard set of illumination if in, let's say, 10% of manuscripts. And one of them is in Prague Castle, Metropolitan Chapter Library, and he's really nice.
Why is it nice? What is nice about it? Is it colored and with golden leaf and lots of details? What do you like about it? Or is it more about how it was drawn?
No, it was drawn really in a nice way. So it's interesting because it's not in a nice manuscript. So it's expensive text within the manuscript, which is not really nice, but which was brought together in the Middle Ages. What is interesting about these illuminations may be that the 8th piece of Among Commoners, this is a piece of someone who is not really working and spent his time in a pub. because it is also a part of the society, and Czechia knew it. And in this on this illumination, there is a man playing dice on the illumination, and in the margin there was a woman, maybe prostitute, illuminated on the margin. She should be together with him in this society, because otherwise there is only the queen, the only female figure,
I see.
and the others are men.
Are men, yeah. Medieval worldview. Thank you. Now we will take a short break and return in a few minutes.
We would love to know what you think of the program, so join CU Medieval Radio on Facebook and leave a comment.
Welcome back. Before we go on to our next topic, your other research, I wanted to ask you about what is codicology and how does it help you as a historian to deal with these manuscripts?
Codicology is a science about medieval manuscripts and books. Codicologist could tell us what kind of scribe have write this text, can discern scribal hands. He knows a lot about binding of medieval manuscript, if they were put together in the Middle Ages or in 19th century. Afterwards, what kind of material there was used, if it's paper or pergamon. And also that's what is very important is the question of datation of manuscripts. You can date manuscripts after watermarks, when the paper is used, but not when pergamon is used. Can date after the script, actually, but it's not very accurate, like the second half of 14th century could be. And also, if the manuscript was meant for personal reading or if it was more for presentation, let's say like a gift for somebody important.
I see.
And well, that's it.
Yes.
Yeah, and how can it help to historian? It's
Yes.
the very important information. The question is if the historian working with manuscripts should be able to do part of this task himself. But sometimes you need the help of a real codicologist. And what is also important to say that there are many codicologists and they are working hard and they are preparing for us, pure historians, the catalogs of medieval libraries where these basic information are set. So it's very helpful.
And one more short question. How does one become a codicologist? What do you have to study? Usually, do they come from like art history courses or do they come from book restoration courses? Or are they just historians who have a particular interest in this and they educate themselves?
It's different in different countries, actually. There is a set of so-called auxiliary historical sciences, and codicology is one of them.
I see.
Like paleography, epigraphy, and so on. And in Czech Republic, for example, you can study auxiliary historical sciences together with history. And nowadays is always the auxiliary historical sciences are always together with archival studies.
I see.
In Germany is the same. There is a tradition of Wissenschaften, and they are even professors of this auxiliary historical sciences in Germany. But you can, I think, become a codicologist if you start with history and then you just love these medieval manuscripts. You fell in love with the manuscripts and you become codicologist.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask a little bit about your previous research, your dissertation topic. As I understood, it was mainly about the figure of Charles IV, the Emperor of Holy Roman Empire, of course. I love him because he contributed very much to the late medieval culture of Prague, and I am particularly fond of Prague cathedrals. But what was your interest in his character and in the culture that he built around himself and in his country.
Charles IV is part of heyday of the late medieval culture in Bohemia, and he's an important figure even nowadays for historical consciousness of people in Czech Republic. I started with him with the analysis of his coronation order, which is quite interesting.
Can you tell us what the coronation order is?
There is a genre in medieval literature. It begins as a liturgical tool. The order, how the right coronation should be organized. Who should say what, when the archbishop take the sword and give it to the king, and what the king said, and so on. What is sung, etc. There are many coronation orders in all over Europe, but not so many. But we can compare them. There is a strong tradition in France, French coronation order, and with 13th century or during the 13th century, these orders became regional, specific for specific kingdom, and it's not no more a liturgical genre, but it became a source of political thought of concrete kingdom, and that's the case for the coronation order of Charles IV. Charles IV spent 7 years as a young boy at the court of King of France, where he saw surely in 1328 the coronation of the first Valois king, Philip VI. And then he came back to Bohemia, became the king of Bohemia and the king of Romans, and he tried to make a new redaction of the coronation order, the first one for Czech kings, I believe. And it's interesting to see what is put there in this coronation order from his politics. He tried very hard to legitimate the Luxembourg power in Bohemia. He was the second from the Luxembourg dynasty ruling, and it was quite clear that he is a legitimate king. But he tried to assure this legitimation. And part of the legitimation was that he was a son of last princes from the Přemyslit dynasty, the dynasty who reigned in Bohemia since ever. And he tried it to show this legitimation, for example, with the very beginning of the coronation. At the beginning of the coronation, the day before, the future king should go from the Prague castle in procession to the Vyšehrad, place of memory of Přemyslit era, and then come back to the Prague castle and wait during the night to the coronation. But why is it in the order? Because Vyšehrad was an important place in Charles' time, but why to go in the procession through the whole city? And my answer, what I found in a chronicle of Příběh Pulkava of Radenín, one of author of the Charles court, is that he should venerate there at the Vyšehrad 2 objects of the memory of Přemyslit era, boots and a bag, because there is a old legend of the first ruler from the Přemyslit dynasty, that he was a plowman taken by Princess Libuše to become the first prince of Bohemia. And according to this legend, he took with himself these boots and the bag. And when they are asking him, why are you taking these things, that you will become a ruler of Bohemia, you will not need them, he said, I want that my offspring knows that we are from the common people. And this story is in the chronicle from the Charles' time. And so obviously there was a part of this Přemyslit memory which should be venerated during the coronation. It's just one of the examples. The other one is the veneration of Saint Wenceslaus, the most important saint in Bohemia. There is a Saint Wenceslaus sword, Saint Wenceslaus crown used during the coronation. There is a Saint Wenceslaus chapel in the cathedral from where the holy oil should be brought for the coronation.
Can you tell us who was Wenceslaus originally and why is he important to Czechia?
It's a Duke of Bohemia from the 10th century who was killed by his brother and became very quickly a saint patron of Czechs. And as a member of the Přemysly dynasty, he became also the patron of the ruling family. And during the 12th century, he became an eternal ruler of Bohemia who gave just for some time the rule to concrete actual ruler.
I see.
But he is the eternal. And Charles IV used this idea of eternal ruler in his idea of the patron saint of the dynasty. Because he ordered the new crown, which became the crown for Czech kings forever. Even today is there. We are not a kingdom anymore, but there is a...
You still have the crown.
Yeah, we still have the crown. And the crown was called St. Wenceslaus crown. And it was donated to St. Wenceslaus. And it was used only for coronation. And the time it should be on the school of St. Wenceslaus in the cathedral.
So we were talking about the coronation order and what the different parts of this ceremony symbolized. I wanted to ask, maybe it's a very difficult question to answer, but who was this ceremony meant for? So who were the audience? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. If you want to have an idea how the coronation could look like in the Middle Ages, you can go to YouTube, and there is a coronation of Elizabeth II from the 53, I think. And there are like 60% of the coronation order is the same for the Charles IV in 14th century and Great Britain in 12th century. But there is one big difference. The church is much bigger. So the audience is bigger. If you think about cathedrals and churches in 13th, 14th century, some of them are quite big. But the reality was slightly different. The Cathedral of St. Vitus was started to build in 1344, so 3 years after Charles was crowned. So there was not cathedral.
Yeah.
Not at all. There was old basilics and ruined somehow slowly and built a new cathedral, but it was finished in 20th century, so it was not finished. And in churches before Trident, there was always a wall between the
choir and the nave.
Yeah. So that's the question. Who can actually see
what
the coronation?
Happening?
How many people can see? How many people can hear what was sung or what was said? It was everything in Latin. Well, in Charles' coronation order, there are 2 Czech passages. One is the acclamation of the people. It's fiat in Latin, but in order it should be shout in Czech. Rádi, rádi, rádi. We are glad to. And the second one is an old religious song, which should be sung during the entronization.
I see.
Clerics should sing Laudamus, etc. And the non-clerics should sing Hospodine pomiluj mě, which is an old song in Czech, actually the oldest one and connected to Přemyslit era. So, who was the public? We don't know exactly, but we know from some sources from 15th century, for example, that people wanted to go there and cannot and complain about protection for the people going inside. But the part of the medieval coronation was always some kind of procession through the city that everybody could see the king. And maybe that's always behind this idea of the procession from Prague Castle to Vyšehrad and back, because I believe that it was not written for coronation of Charles IV. It's too much complex and well done, and it was in hurry in 1347. So I believe that it was written after as a part of a legacy of Charles IV for his son, because the new town of Prague was founded 1348, and in the town of coronation of Charles IV, the Charles Bridge was not there because the old bridge was destroyed by water, high water in 42, and the new bridge was built at the end of the time of Charles IV. I believe that it was meant to procession through the whole city, the new town also, until the Vyšehrad, and over the stone bridge back to Prague Castle. What is a little bit paradoxical is that finally Charles IV has go through this procession when he was dead, because there is a funeral procession with his body going exactly this way. So they took him from Prague Castle through the old town, new town, to the Vyšehrad, and then through some important churches in medieval Prague. And after 4 days, he come back to Prague Cathedral for the funeral.
It's a nice framing, I think. So he should begin this at the beginning of his rule, and he did this at the end of his rule. What else did you study about how Charles IV tried to legitimize his power? Did he do things outside of Prague? Or how did he behave as a patron of the arts?
Actually, he did a lot for his legitimacy. Of course, lots of these things are done in Prague, his imperial seat. Not so much elsewhere. He founded some castles and altars in Roman Empire. For instance, the altars of St. Wenceslaus to venerate his Czech patron saint. You maybe know that Charles himself was born and baptized as Wenceslaus, and he changed his name when he came to the Parisian court. During the confirmation, he became Charles. And because of the idea of Charlemagne, the first medieval emperor, he used only the name Charles during his reign. But sometimes, when it was appropriate, he reminds people that he was also a Wenceslaus.
He had a double identity.
It was like to have a double patron saint. There is a sermon delivered during the coronation of Charles IV in Prague, and in this sermon there is explicitly said that he is Wenceslaus as well as Charles, because he is Saint Wenceslaus and as well as Saint Charlemagne, that these two patron saints are in him or looking after him, to be more accurate. And that's also interesting. He helped to found the Saint Charlemagne, or the Charlemagne is an important figures in medieval culture generally. But his status of saint is rather problematic.
Yeah, was he actually
he was
ever made a saint?
Yeah, Charlemagne was promoted saint during the reign of Frederick Barbarossa by the anti-pope. So, from the very beginning, it was problematic, and for popes and for papal curia, he was not a saint, actually. He was venerated even before as a founder in some southern French monasteries, for example. So there are local venerations of Saint Charlemagne. And when Charles IV came with this idea of the veneration of Saint Charlemagne generally, the Pope was against. But he enabled him to found a monastery of Saint Charlemagne in Prague. There is a monastery of Our Lady and Saint Charlemagne called Karlov nowadays, Augustinians. And from this Prague monastery, there was another one, a chapter actually, founded in Ingelheim in Germany. And Ingelheim is the place where, according to Godfrey of Viterbo, Charlemagne was born. So there is a chapter founded from Prague, directed from Prague, with the veneration of Saint Charlemagne, with the cult of Saint Charlemagne. That's one of examples. So Charles IV was prolific and passionate collector of relics. And one of these relics are teeth of Saint Charlemagne. He disposed of 3 of them at least, and one of them he sent to French king, his nephew Charles V of Valois, with a letter Then they are both Charleses, and there is the third one, the Saint Germain, and so on. And from this time onwards, we can see even on the French court, there is a growing veneration of Saint Germain. Mm-hmm. I dare to say that it was also an partly influence of Charles IV, that someone like Germain, he was very important for French kings from the very beginning of the kingdom, but he was not seen as a saint. Mm-hmm. And from the end of 14th century, he was venerated even as a saint.
If I remember correctly, even from my art historical studies, we were studying Karlštejn Castle, and there's a family tree of Charles IV there, if I remember correctly. And it had Charlemagne towards the beginning, so somehow he wasn't only a spiritual great-grandfather, but an actual great-grandfather as well.
Yeah, but I should say that Charlemagne was very popular for every fictive genealogy in the Middle Ages. And you can find him literally in every genealogy. Mm-hmm. He should be there. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And he very often begins the genealogy. But what this so-called genealogy of Karlštejn, it's not really a genealogy. It's much more. At Karlštejn, there was a line of rulers going back to Noé. And there are biblical figures. Then there are fictive person from Troya, Priamos. And then it goes through this idea of Trojan origin of French kings, through Merovingian to Carolingian with Charlemagne, of course, and then it's going until the Charles IV. And it's kind of a genealogical fiction through time.
So it's all the people who have been good rulers of their people. Okay, let's take another short break. We are back. In this short break, you were telling us about a medieval mystery in Karlštejn Castle. Can you explain us what it is about?
It's good that the historians could always find something which is not easy to explain or which resists the explanation. And one of these is a group of people painted on a wall on the stairs when you are going in the Karlštejn Castle up to the chapel, and there are figures, especially female figures, painted on the wall, and we dispose even a very similar copy from the Middle Ages in one manuscript in Wolfenbüttel. Mm-hmm. And so there are these figures, female but also male figures, with many crowns on their heads, 2 or 3. We know that the grandfather of Charles IV, it was the Czech king Wenceslaus II, he became the Czech king and then the king of Poland. So he could wear 2 crowns. The son of Wenceslaus II was Wenceslaus III, who became the king of Hungary under the name Ladislav V, just for a very short time, and he couldn't get the legitimacy finally. Mm-hmm. But theoretically, after the death of his father, he could call himself the triple king of Central Europe, mm-hmm. let's say.
So Poland,
Bohemia, and Hungary. So this Visegrad king. And he could be the person who is there with 3 crowns on mm-hmm. his head. But it doesn't make sense together. There mm-hmm. are too many females around, and they are even coat of arms who can help us. Mm-hmm. But again, it's confusing. Some of them could be identified with Wittelsbach, some of them could be identified with Czech kings, but the others are rather confusing, and we can't really explain what this concrete lineage should represent. Mm-hmm. And without the good explanation of the pergament copy, we mm-hmm. couldn't understand these figures on the wall, on the stairs of Karlštejn. So there is a mystery what we got from the Charles mm-hmm. IV's time until today.
Mm-hmm. It should be related to him and his family, but we don't know how at this point.
It makes sense that the whole Karlštejn is actually from the point of view of history of art, it's very complicated system of representation of the dynasty, himself as a chosen one to become the emperor, so the most important person in the world. So even this group of figures on the wall should represent something related to his position or his family. Mm-hmm. And when we are heading this chapel, the most important part of the whole Karlštejn, the treasury of Imperium was hidden, so it couldn't be something non-important. That's not an option. But we can't really understand.
Mm-hmm. And what do the female figures look like? So are they noble women?
Yeah.
Could they be biblical figures or something? Not very likely.
Not very likely. They are definitely noble figures, and they look like queens or part of family. And they are in the veneration position. So there should be some explanation, some signification linked to the chapel.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, I think I would like to ask, so what do you think about the connection between your two topics? So you're dealing with with the same geographical area, with the same time frame. So, for example, what do you think the effect of Charles IV was on the literary production at the time? Did he act also as a patron of books and book production in the late medieval Bohemia?
Yeah, he played an important role, not only as a patron of the university, but it's fair to say that he was not patron in the sense that he paid a lot of money for university or churches or monasteries. He founded a lot of monasteries, but and gave just some money, and the rest was always on the monastery too. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's the case also of the university. He founded the university in 1408, but there was not enough money and people to flourish for the university. And when in Austria and Poland they come up with their universities, so there was a real concurrence for Prague University, and the Prague University was at the risk of end of their existence. Actually, he founded finally the college for professors and started the real life of the university, but he was not someone who wanted to pay a lot of money for his projects. It's the same partly for the literary production. We know that he was very interested in the religious literature, but not some devotio moderna. It's much more traditional way of literary thought. And also, and that's the part of his politics actually, is he was very interested in history, in historiography. So we know that he asked 4 people to write a history of Bohemia. Some old history from the very beginning until his time, but also a history of his reign. So he was interested in legitimacy through history, the use of history, use of the past for the legitimation of his time, of his reign. But he was also interested in his image afterwards.
I see.
And he was quite good in it because it works. Even nowadays, when you are talking with people in Czech Republic about Charles IV, you can hear the very same what was written on his court in 14th century. A good, wise, pious ruler who founded a university, built a bridge, stone bridge, called nowadays after him. So he's very present. And one of the reasons for this good image is actually the historiography of his time, who was then copied in other works, and the image stayed the same until, well, now. And also, if we talk about vernacularization of the literature, about beginning of Czech written literature in 14th century Bohemia, his role could be important. There are no clear links, or very few. But we know, for instance, that the important role was played by a monastery of Slavonic monks in Emmaus, so-called Emmaus today, in this monastery where these monks copied a lot of texts in Czech, in the Glagolitic script, but the texts were in Czech. And we know from the Foundation Charter that Charles IV paid one scribe for 5 years, I think, to copy every literature needed to build a library for this monastery. So there was some kind of official support, and also the symbolical meaning of the vernacular. As I said, in the coronation order, the vernacular was seen much more symbolical than even in the everyday life. We have no charter in Czech from his time. We have a lot of German charters. We have some French charters, a lot of Latin charters, of course, but no Czech. This started, the use of the language, of the Czech language as an administrative language, started with his son, Wenceslaus IV. But there were some support because of the symbolical meaning of the vernacular.
Thank you. And before we say goodbye, I wanted to ask you about your future plans. Where do you see your projects going, and what will you do in the next year? Will you come back to visit us at CEU?
Of course, I would like to come back. And now I'm working in a project, so I'm at the very end of this project about Jacobus de Cesoris and the bestsellers in Bohemia. And now I am in a project about conflict and institutionalization of the conflict in medieval Bohemia, with the Hussite wars and the life afterwards. We try to analyze how the society deal with conflict as a permanent state, how the conflict became peace-like existence, like the people who begins in a war against some, or how the civil war can become a normal existence, let's say. And what I'm doing is analyze of the role of the king in this. So how the king could become a pacifier of the situation in the kingdom. That's my plan.
Okay, thank you for coming today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.